Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 8th. On this day in 2009, 8-year-old Victoria Tori Stafford's life was tragically cut short. This case not only shook the small Canadian community of Woodstock, Ontario, but also garnered nationwide attention. We'll talk about Tori, her life, what happened to her on that tragic day, and how her family has been carrying on her legacy. Let's get started. Born on July 15, 2000, in the small, close-knit town of Woodstock, Ontario, Victoria Elizabeth Marie Stafford was the youngest child of Tara MacDonald and Rodney Stafford. Tori was a loving child, and she adored her big brother, Darren. The two were inseparable. They were partners in crime, playmates, and best friends all in one. From a young age, Tori was known for her bright smile, her boundless energy, and her infectious laugh. Whether she was cracking jokes, singing at the top of her lungs, or lending a hand to a classmate, Tori had a way of making everybody just a bit happier by being around. But like many kids, her family life had some challenges. Her parents had separated, and she mostly lived with her mom, Tara, but still spent a lot of time with her dad, Rodney. Both parents were present and active in her life, and they adored her. By early spring of 2009, Tori was doing what most kids her age do. She was hanging out with friends, going to school, and enjoying the newfound independence of being able to walk home from school on her own. It was a small but important step for her. It was a sign she was growing up, if even just a little bit. But what no one could have imagined is that a seemingly ordinary walk home on April 8th would change everything. What started as a routine afternoon became the start of a nightmare, one that would grip a nation, devastate a community, and leave a permanent scar on all who know Tori's story. April 8th was a little crisp, but the promise of warmer weather was in the air. For Tori, it was a typical school morning. She dressed herself in a black Hannah Montana t-shirt, a green jacket with white fur trim, and a pair of purple and black boots. Tori was in grade 3 at Oliver Stevens Public School, and school let out at 3:25 p.m. Tori, like always, left on foot, headed toward her mom's house on Francis Street. It was a short walk. It was less than 10 minutes, and it was one that Tori had done many times before. But this time, she didn't come home. When Tori failed to arrive, her mother, Tara, initially thought Tori was with her father or maybe at a friend's house. But as those calls came up empty, panic set in. By 6:04 p.m., her grandmother, Linda Winters, had called the police. That evening, police obtained a grainy surveillance video from a nearby high school. It showed Tori walking away from school just 7 minutes after the bell rang, at 3:32 p.m. But she wasn't alone. Walking calmly beside her was a young woman with dark hair dressed in a white puffy jacket. The video quickly became the focal point of the investigation, and it would later be confirmed to be the last image of Tori alive. What stood out was how relaxed Tori looked, how at ease she seemed with the woman beside her. And investigators believed that that detail was crucial. Tori hadn't been grabbed or forced, she was walking willingly, which meant perhaps that she knew this woman. The search for Tori, of course, kicked off with urgency. Police officers, community volunteers, and family members canvassed neighborhoods, handed out flyers, and checked nearby woods and open fields. The Ontario Provincial Police, along with the RCMP, joined local authorities, setting up a command center and bringing in search dogs, helicopters, and ground crews. Despite the scale of the effort, there was no sign of Tori. One decision that would come under fire in the days ahead was the police's choice not to issue an Amber Alert. Authorities later explained that Tori's disappearance didn't initially meet the criteria because there was no confirmed abduction. But for a worried community watching the hours tick by, That explanation didn't feel good enough. As the days stretched into weeks, hopes began to dim, but the fight for Tori didn't let up. Her family appeared on television, tearfully pleading for her return. Candlelight vigils sprang up throughout the city, and people began tying purple ribbons, Tori's favorite color, to fences, trees, and car antennas. In the weeks after Tori Stafford vanished, police kept digging. Quietly, methodically, they were building a profile. They were looking at behavioral cues, examining connections within the community, and interviewing people in Tori's orbit. And one name kept surfacing: Terry Lynn McClintock. At 18 years old, McClintock was a troubled young woman who was already known to police and social services. She'd had a difficult upbringing and had crossed paths, albeit briefly, with Tori's mother, Tara. When the investigation kicked off, McClintock actually presented herself to authorities, offering information, even volunteering to take a polygraph. At first glance, she came off as just another concerned community member trying to help. But something didn't sit right. Over multiple interviews, detectives began to notice cracks in her story. Her tone would shift. Details she offered didn't match known facts. She had information that hadn't been released to the public. And though she seemed willing to talk, some of her answers felt rehearsed. Investigators continued to push, and over time, the pressure mounted. Then, 41 agonizing days after Tori's disappearance, May 19, 2009, Terry Lynn McClintock finally confessed. Her admission was shocking. Not only had she been involved, she had lured Tori from outside of her school. And she hadn't acted alone. McClintock named her 28-year-old boyfriend, Michael Rafferty, as the orchestrator of it all. According to her confession, Rafferty had pressured her into finding a young girl. On April 8th, McClintock approached Tori, offered to show her a puppy, and gently led her to Rafferty's waiting car. From there, the two adults drove Tori out of town. They drove until they reached a remote area near Mount Forest, Ontario. And it was there that the true horror unfolded. McClintock told police that Tori was sexually assaulted by Rafferty. Afterward, the couple used a hammer that McClintock had bought earlier that day at Home Depot, to beat the child to death. They then hid her body beneath a pile of rocks in the woods. The next day, on May 20th, police arrested and charged both McClintock and Rafferty. She was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault causing bodily harm. In addition to her confession, the evidence was mounting fast. Store surveillance videos showed McClintock buying the murder weapon. GPS data from Rafferty's car traced their journey, and witnesses confirmed seeing them together on the day of Tori's disappearance. Then, on July 19th, 2 months after the arrests, McClintock led police to a rural field near Mount Forest. And there, hidden among the trees and earth, they found Tori's remains. The search was over, and for the people of Woodstock, Canada, and Tori's devastated family, the confirmation of what they had feared all along was almost too much to bear. How could someone who was connected to the family, albeit peripherally, betray their trust in such a horrifying way? And how could a young woman, barely more than a child herself, play such an active role in the kidnapping and murder of a child? The journey to justice for Tori Stafford unfolded in two emotionally wrenching chapters. First, through the guilty plea of Terry Lynn McClintock, and later in a high-profile trial that would see Michael Rafferty convicted of her murder. McClintock's plea came quietly, almost in secret. On April 30th, 2010, just over a year after Tori vanished, McClintock stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The public wouldn't even learn about this until months later due to a publication ban that kept the court proceedings sealed at the time. As part of her plea, McClintock received a mandatory life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. Then, nearly 2 years later, on March 5, 2012, the focus shifted to Michael Rafferty. His trial, held in London, Ontario, was followed closely by the nation. People watched with a mix of anger and sorrow as the case unfolded over 10 long weeks. The Crown's case painted Rafferty as the driving force behind the crime. He was the one who planned it, facilitated it, and ultimately carried it out. He was the man who had preyed on Tori, assaulted her, and beaten her to death. The evidence was overwhelming. Jurors heard Terry Lynn McClintock's testimony, saw the surveillance footage and the GPS data from his car. They also examined cell phone records and store receipts. While McClintock's credibility was a point of attack for the defense, her story remained consistent with the forensic evidence. And the raw, emotional images presented during the trial, photos from the crime scene and autopsy, left no doubt in anyone's mind about the brutality of the crime. On May 11, 2012, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all 3 charges. Justice Thomas Heaney did not mince words. As he handed down the mandatory life sentence with no parole for 25 years, he called the crime, quote, unspeakably evil, end quote. But Rafferty, even in the face of a guilty verdict, continued to fight. He launched multiple appeals, arguing that the jury had been improperly instructed and that media coverage had biased the trial. But in 2016, the Ontario Court of Appeal upheld his conviction. And in 2019, the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed his final appeal, closing the door on any further legal challenges. But even that wasn't exactly the end of the story. Years later, McClintock's transfer to a healing lodge, a facility meant for Indigenous rehabilitation, ignited a firestorm of national debate about justice and the rights of convicted murderers. For many Canadians, the very idea that someone involved in the death of a child could serve time in a less restrictive environment was deeply disturbing. After public outcry, the public safety minister stepped in, ordering a review. Eventually, McClintock was transferred back to a higher security facility. But the incident exposed deep flaws in how Correctional Service Canada makes decisions about inmate placement, especially in high-profile or violent cases. Many wondered, how could this transfer happen without any public knowledge? And how could the system allow such a move without consulting the victim's family or considering the crime's severity? For Tori's family, the years that followed her death were filled with heartbreak, public attention, and the slow, painful process of trying to find some version of healing. Her father, Tori Stafford, emerged as a powerful voice in the aftermath. He didn't just grieve, he fought. He became a relentless advocate for victims' rights, determined that no other family should have to experience what he had. He spoke out time and time again about the flaws he saw in Canada's justice system. He believed it was too lenient, too focused on the rights of offenders, and not nearly focused enough on the people left behind by violent crime. Back in Woodstock, Tori's memory continues to shine. A tree was planted in her honor at her elementary school. And over the years, Tori's name has been linked to efforts to strengthen child protection laws, improve the Amber Alert system, and reform sentencing and parole practices for violent offenders. She is remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for progress. Because Tori Stafford wasn't just a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. And her story deserves to be told, not just for what was lost, but for what we can still change. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Tori's story moving, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!